Hi guys, it's Grace with Grace Gets Gastric, and I'm here today for my Q1 2020 book/reading roundup. So I know these aren't the most popular videos that I do, but reading is something that I very much enjoy. I do a lot of, and for the few of you out there that are interested in hearing about what I read, what I enjoyed, and perhaps getting some recommendations, you know, there's these videos. So if you're interested in hearing about what I read over the past 3 months, what I loved, what I didn't love, what was just okay, then keep watching. All right, so in the great category to start us off, we have Thick by Tressie McMillan Cotton. So this is a collection of essays that kind of have to do with, you know, capitalism, America, Blackness, feminism, all of the intersection of those things, academia. It's a really well curated collection of essays. The essays all really made sense together. They felt cohesive. They kind of felt like they had a sort of central theme. And of course, the writing was very excellent, very thought-provoking, very interesting. So definitely one I would recommend. And it was nice because it is a collection of short stories, so you could just read one at a time if you don't have a ton of time to read, which is what I did. I just read one a day for like 8 days. I think there's 8 of them. And it was just a nice little injection of reading. And you'll notice also, I did a lot of nonfiction reading over the past 3 months, so there's a lot of nonfiction in this list this time around. So the next book we have is The Moment of Lift by Melinda Gates. This is also a nonfiction book, really about feminism, basically the importance of gender equality and how that lifts not only women around the world, but also everybody. How by empowering disenfranchised and marginalized groups, you actually make the whole better. And I just thought it was really well written, really inspiring, very interesting, also very accessible. So it didn't feel, you know, too technical or too deep in the weeds. I thought it was a great book. Next we have Antisemitism Here and Now by Deborah Lipstadt. And this is an excellent book. I have been you know, I try to read a lot about, as I've talked about before, other marginalized groups, really trying to expand my knowledge and awareness of, you know, what other people are going through that have experiences that are perhaps different than my own. And anti-Semitism is something that is, unfortunately, I mean, it's been around for a very long time and has seen a resurgence in the Western world. And it's something that I've sort of not paid as much attention to as I think I should be, that I sort of allowed myself to focus on other social justice issues, and it was something that I really wanted to learn more about and become a little bit more knowledgeable about. So I thought this was a really excellent book, and it was a very balanced book. You know, it talked about the issues of anti-Semitism on both sides of the aisle. With some of these, with some social justice books, there's definitely a focus on the way that it manifests in a more extreme way, perhaps on the extreme right, which is obviously not good and something that we need to be aware of. But in some ways, the insidious nature of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism on the left is almost more damaging just because it is so subtle. It can be hard to combat. So anyways, I thought it was a really balanced and interesting look, and it was very digestible, very easily accessible. Next we have White Rage by Carol Anderson. So I read a lot about racism, and this was an excellent book. Definitely, you know, I've read so many of them, and they all are really, for the most part, I haven't really read any bad ones on racism. Perhaps luck of the draw, and I obviously have been gravitating towards ones that I've heard good things about. But this was definitely a focus on America and kind of the history of racism and sort of the, you know, institutional nature of it. And I thought it was, you know, very, you know, in some ways deeply painful to just realize how ingrained and how much we have to overcome in this country. That it is more than just kind of overt instances of racism. It is really a systematic issue. And I think that knowledge is the first step in being able to fight and overcome that. Similar vein, we have The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And this book was fantastic. This is all about, the subtitle is Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And it is really a stark and terrifying look at our criminal justice system within the United States and the way that it has systematically and unfairly been targeted towards people of color, and in particular men of color. And just really looking at the statistics and hearing about just the way that our system was essentially built to function as a, essentially an alternate form of slavery, a legal form of slavery, since that was abolished. So it really has kind of fired me up about criminal justice and social justice, or criminal justice reform. And yeah, it is, it's been very interesting with the coronavirus and in thinking about our issue. We have an issue of over and mass incarceration in the United States, particularly because of the war on drugs, which was meant to mass incarcerate people of color, men of color in particular. And we have overcrowding in our prisons and our jails. We have all of these people packed in over relatively minor offenses, and now there is a pandemic, and they're all like trapped inside. It's it's very interesting. So I highly recommend that one, particularly for those who live in the United States. And then finally we have the Vagina Bible by Jennifer Gunter. So this is really, really interesting. It's all about the vagina and the vulva. It is, the whole kind of kit and caboodle, if you will. And it really is, it's broken down into chapters. It kind of talks about any questions you might have, questions, concerns, thoughts you have. It really debunks a lot of misinformation that we've been told. I mean, women have been told that they're dirty and they're unclean, and that it's shameful. And so there's just a lot of misinformation that has been perpetrated out into the world in regards to the vagina and the vulva. So it was really interesting. I learned a lot, and yeah, I highly recommend if you have or want to have a vagina. I think it was a great book. It was cool. They had a specific chapter all about vaginas and vulvas in transition. So specifically for trans men and women who have or will have a vagina. And then they also, throughout the book, they will make she makes references to some of the differences that you might experience, if you're on T, or if you had a surgically constructed vagina. Obviously there are some differences there. So yeah, it was really interesting. So next we move on to the good pile of books, just a few here. So these are books that I enjoyed, but for one reason or another, I didn't absolutely love. And it's a little bit arbitrary this time around, but the first book we have is a Pulitzer Prize winner, so not a nonfiction book, and that is March by Geraldine Brooks. So this is actually a transformative work, which means it is based on or inspired by another novel, and that is Little Women. So this book takes place from the point of view of the father that is missing for pretty much the entire Little Women book, and he is as working as a minister with the chaplain, I think, during the Civil War. With the Union troops. So it was kind of from his point of view. So it was very interesting just because like many women, Little Women was a book that I loved in my younger days when I first read it. Definitely kind of one of those, seminal works. And so it was really interesting to read this book from the point of view of the father and, kind of have those references to the characters and events from the original work. So I thought that was really interesting. Next, we have Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. And I did really enjoy this book. This really could have gone in the great category, but I felt like the good category was a little low. It was really interesting. I would say the reason why I knocked it down to good instead of great was it did feel a little bit more surface level. And I think part of that is because I have been reading, as you can tell, so much about race, and not just in this month, but the past year, really. And so I didn't feel like this particular book was really saying anything super new, but that is possibly because I had just been reading so much about it and already kind of been informed. And the other thing is, and this is actually kind of a pro and a con, not even really a con, but it is from the point of view of a person in Great Britain, in England. And so it is not America focused, which in one respect I actually very much enjoyed, because nearly all of my reading on race and racism has been focused on America, because that is where I live. So I did actually appreciate getting that alternate point of view, but in some ways it was slightly less applicable to me. I mean, it's all applicable, of course, but you know, it's referencing slightly different social dynamics and structures. And so in that sense, I think that was slightly less applicable, and that's why, part of why I knocked it down. But really, I did very much enjoy it, and it could have been great. And then the final one is, shocking, not a nonfiction book, but it's Record of a Spaceborne Few by Becky Chambers. This is the third book in the Wayfarers sci-fi series, which I've talked about, I think in my last or previous books. I've read the first two. I loved the first two, and I very much liked the third one, but I didn't like it as much as the first two. So I think partially the first two set such a high bar that this one just fell a little bit short of that. And I think if I'd read it first or earlier on, I wouldn't have suffered so much. Partially the way I just would have reordered the structure of the book, or of the series. So, you know, there's 3 books so far, and the first book has characters that are kind of, you know, a character that's introduced in the first book is mentioned in the second book, and or vice versa. You know, a character that's mentioned in the first book is like the main character in the second book. The third book, the characters in the third book are mentioned in the first book, but there's no link between the second and the third. And the first two are very character focused, very micro view. And the third book is like the point of view of multiple people, and it's very macro view. And so I think it just was a little bit a weird transition. In my opinion, I think it would have made more sense for the third book to be the first one. Start it with that macro view. You have characters that are linked between books 3 and 1. So you could have gone 3, 1, 2. That's how I would have ordered it, and I think it would have made more sense to me mentally. But I'm not the author. I still very much enjoyed it. I would still very much recommend the series as a whole. It just wasn't quite as enjoyable as the first two. Sorry, long explanation. And finally, we have the meh category. So these are books that were okay. Didn't particularly enjoy them for one reason or another. So the first we have is The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron. This is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I did think this was superbly written, which of course you would expect with a Pulitzer Prize winner. It was beautifully written, very evocative. I could very much kind of picture the characters and what was happening. And part of what I disliked about it, I mean, it wasn't like my favorite story overall, but it is based on a true story of basically the bloodiest slave rebellion. And it is from the point of view of the leader of this slave rebellion, which is a black man, a slave. And it's written by a white man. And the feeling and the optics of it is a little bit iffy for me. I think that I just don't know that it was his story to tell, and that did kind of cloud and impede upon my ability to really get into the book and enjoy it fully. I think regardless, it just really wasn't for my particular cup of tea, but just being aware of that dynamic, and sometimes it's impossible to separate the author from the book and the story being told. And so it was kind of in the back of my mind the whole time that when the main character, and obviously this is a fictionalized account based on real events, you know, so it's not 100% this is exactly what happened, right? Like, we've got his thoughts, his feelings, and just some of the tropes utilized were quite damaging racist stereotypes. And obviously this was written, you know, this wasn't written super currently, but yeah, it did leave a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth. Then we have The Death of Truth by, I cannot read this, I think Michiko Kakatani. Nonfiction book about the death of truth. I just thought this was boring and uninspired. I didn't think that there was anything interesting or new being told here or shared here. This wasn't anything that somebody who is existing in the world today and at all aware of kind of the current events, it couldn't have formed their own opinions on. I just wasn't really sure what the point of it was. It didn't feel like it was really adding anything to the story at all. So, meh. Then we have The Optimist Daughter by Eudora Welty, another Pulitzer Prize winner. And I just thought this was boring. It was thankfully short, so that's the best thing I can say about it. It was a very short read. It just, again, one of those books where I wasn't really quite sure what the point was. I was bored. I didn't really care about the characters. I didn't really feel like there was a message. There was a central theme or point. So I was just bored. Didn't care for it. But thankfully, it was short. And then finally, we have The Japanese Lover by Isabel Allende, which I love this author. I've been reading them for years. I've a very special place in my heart. They are Chilean. They write a lot of magical realism, which I love. And I think when they stray away from that magical realism is where they kind of lose me. And this was not a bad book, but it didn't really have any kind of like South America. You know, she writes a lot of stuff specifically with Chile, which I think is her strong suit. Again, I didn't really have any of that. It felt weird. It felt kind of like she was phoning it in a little bit. It was fairly predictable plot, kind of bland. Just, it wasn't bad. Again, this is one of those things where maybe I'm holding it to a slightly higher standard because I've loved so many of her books and I know that she can do better. But I also was not alone in thinking that this was not her best work. So anyways, that is a roundup of, it's not every single book I read, like I said before, or I've said in previous like I've said in previous videos, I am a huge reader. I read a lot of kind of romance books as well. Those kinds of books I can read in a few hours, in a single night. And those are just sort of mindless fluff to, kind of keep my mind sharp because it's books, but they're not necessarily highbrow literature, which I don't have any problem with. I love them, but I also love reading other things. And because I legitimately have read over 100 books in the past 3 months, I do try to curate a list for you all so that I am not here forever. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books and if you have, what you thought of them. Or let me know what your favorite book is right now, or your favorite recent read. What are you reading? I always am around for recommendations. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.